Hi, I'm Tim, and welcome to Watch You Want. Thanks for logging on. Today, you're looking at something big. This is the IWC Big Ingenieur, reference 5005-01 from 2007 to 2012. This was the flagship of the iconic IWC Ingenieur line. 45.5 millimeters in stainless steel, but still obviously inspired by the famed Ingenieur SL of 1976, designed by Gerald Genta. This watch combines the best of vintage and modern IWC in a single oversized case. And when you speak of oversized cases, the first question, first and foremost, is how is it going to fit and how is it going to wear? So we go straight to the wrist. On the wrist, 6.3 inches, that's 16 centimeters for ingenieurs in the metric zones of the world, Schaffhausen in particular. You can see this watch fits quite comfortably, and the key there is that the watch is a deceptive cushion case. From the top you might think round watch, but from the side you begin to see that the key to this watch is that it spreads its mass quite evenly. It has more or less a 1-to-1 aspect ratio, and because the strap is already somewhat downward canted by its interface with the lugs, you can see it actually already has a little bit of bend ingenieured into it. It actually fits my smallish wrist fairly well. Now, I would say that this watch wears a bit like maybe I would say a 47 millimeter Panerai Luminor, not a pure cushion case, but still quite supple, quite willing to meet your wrist halfway, so to speak. And I'm even going to say that it doesn't have the characteristic big watch look to it because it is relatively flat. At 15 millimeters thick, I've got to say that it doesn't project too high above the wrist. It actually sits fairly flush, and with that stepped bezel you can see, it's actually got a fighting chance against a dress cuff. For a large sports watch, that's exceptional, that's unusual, and it's important to note if you're looking for a tool watch that could also be your only watch, this watch is off to a flying start in as much as it's not excessively thick, and it does have a little bit of tumble home from the top of the crystal to the flanks of the case. Another feature that really speaks to that versatility is the combination of a white metal and a black dial and strap combination. Formal and versatile, it can really pair with just about anything. As they say, black is always in fashion, so is brushed stainless steel. A collector favorite, it's also a favorite among those who prefer tool watches and traditional IWC design. Now, Schaffhausen is known for its tool watches. The Ingenieur emerged during the 1950s to rival watches like the Omega Railmaster and the Rolex Milgauss. And the line has continued into the current day as something of a mainstay in the IWC catalog. This one in particular is notably gifted because it's bigger with a modern wrist presence, but the shape of the lugs, the shape of the bezel, the way the two flow into each other recalls the best of 1970s Gerald Genta. And you can see how this simulated drilled bezel recalls the bolts that he liked to design into his watches at the time and is echoed in the screw-in case back. Now, engineering, appropriately enough, is a highlight of the Ingenieur. And here you're looking at IWC's caliber 51113. Now, this is the world's largest automatic winding movement, which is an impressive distinction. 37.8 millimeters. The movement alone is bigger than a lot of vintage IWCs, but again, it helps to show the engineering competence of the company. As I've mentioned in other reviews, a watch movement that fills out the entire case is the sign of a strong, competent manufacturer, able to build a movement to the case rather than trying to insert crushes like spacers or stamping out excessively large base plates to awkwardly fill an empty case back. This one fills edge to edge and beautifully detailed with Côte de Genève, graining on all visible wheels, some of it circular, some of it radial, anglage, polished screw countersinks, beautifully optically polished screw heads. The movement is also exceptional from a technical standpoint. Here you can see the highlight. IWC's traditional Albert Pellaton twin-pawl bi-directional winding system. It ensures outstanding winding efficiency and, in combination with a large free-sprung balance, outstanding regularity of power, isochronism, and accurate timing. Let's talk a little bit about precision and timing and what this movement brings to the table, because when you have a watch called the Ingenieur, the technical specs mean just a little bit more. Now, this movement is part of a family that debuted in 2000. IWC introduced the 5000 series, which became the 50,000 series, and this was their follow-up to their half-century-old automatic movements originated in the 1950s. They started with a clean slate, but they incorporated the best of tradition. And starting with the best of tradition, there was the Pellaton winding system. Again, their own in-house design, pawl-based. Because it's bi-directional, you don't have that awkward freewheel of the rotor in either direction, so you don't get that weird wobble on your wrist that you experience with some unidirectional winders. They also incorporated a Breguet overcoil hairspring. Now, the Breguet overcoil, which is considerably older even than IWC itself, is still one of the optimal solutions for maintaining an even rate in many different positions. And that's the key. It's also more thermally resistant and more shock resistant. Handmade, it's an exceptional piece of craftsmanship in its own right, and the balance wheel on this watch is positively huge. It has a high moment of inertia, which means that any given shock or disruption is less likely to break its stride than with a smaller balance wheel. Now, a huge power reserve of 7 days in this watch ensures that it's going to keep accurate time basically wall to wall, because although it's rated for 7 days, it actually has 8 days of power in it. And IWC did this because, like some other high-end watchmakers, they've determined that the mainspring, although it has a longer duration than rated, only gives consistent torque for 7 days. So the watch movement is designed to lock itself after 7 days. Rather than risk timing inaccurately, it will simply communicate that it's stopped and ask you to wind it up manually if it reaches that point. Also, happily, because it's always got a day of power reserve in it, if you do happen to pick it up after it's stopped, it has enough energy to start the balance immediately. So the bottom line is that this is an outstanding movement, sophisticated, in-house manufacture, demonstrating how far IWC has come. All of the heritage of the company accumulated during the 20th century in watchmaking and engineering, with many of the styling traditions that have made the company famous, but in a modern size with modern wrist presence. This is a very fashionable watch. It's also a watch that gives the due nod to tradition. With outstanding horological content, it also has outstanding dial detail. Now, we looked at the case back, but it's worth pondering the front, because there's a lot going on here, and I'm going to see if I can get the light to catch it properly, but I'm probably going to fail. What I want to emphasize is that the dial itself, although broad, is not plain, nor is it sheer or austere. The center is actually an inverted hobnail section, beautifully detailed in person. It may not play on the iPhone. That's why I encourage you to check our website, Watch You Want, and see the high-res photos of this watch, because it's got a lot to offer on close inspection. There's also a stepped 60-minute track around the periphery of the dial that's on a different plane than the hour track. The hour track itself features applied numerals and indexes that really give it that extra element of detail, of resolution, of articulation. There's no point on this dial that feels excessively plain, austere, or in any way an afterthought. There are no default styling touches here. It's very carefully considered, although it's not perfectly balanced. The placement of that date at 6 o'clock and the power reserve at 3 o'clock represent an element of calculated asymmetry, right down to the small bite that the power reserve takes out of the indexes at 2 and at 4 o'clock. Studied, detailed, beautiful, well thought out. Would you expect any less from an Ingenieur? I certainly wouldn't. If you're looking for a tool watch that pretty much does it all, but does it with a modern accent, with modern style and modern panache, you want to check out this IWC Big Ingenieur reference 50501 on our website, 100% complete with all of Schaffhausen's original boxes, manuals, papers, and documents of provenance. I have a feeling this just might be the Ingenieur you want.